Hello friends, come take a walk with me and listen to a new story, and let's think about who's right and who's wrong. Let's go.
Some people spend years building a life only to discover the person standing next to them was quietly taking it apart. Let's listen to one man who didn't fall apart. He fought back smarter than anyone expected.
She told me she'd been seeing someone. Smiled like it would hurt me. I looked her in the eye and said one line that drained every drop of color from her face. She had no idea I'd been ready for this moment for 14 months. My name is Trevor Malone. I'm 48 years old, and for 19 years I built a life that looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Nice house in Knoxville, Tennessee. A daughter named Paige who turns 14 in the spring. A wife named Margot who organized fundraising galas and smiled at everyone like she'd been practicing it since childhood. And me, the guy who spent 16 years with the FBI before trading federal investigations for a private consulting firm that paid twice as much and required half the gunfire. People used to say we were the couple that made it look easy. I should have known then. Nothing that looks easy ever is. I first noticed something was off in January. Not a dramatic thing. Just Margot started carrying 2 phones. She said it was for work. She'd taken on a new client, a real estate developer with high privacy demands. So he insisted his team use separate devices. Reasonable explanation. I believed it. I'd spent 16 years training myself to follow evidence, not assumptions. And the evidence, at the time, said nothing. Then came February. I was home early on a Thursday, rare for me, and I heard her on the back porch. She didn't hear me come in. Her voice was low, careful, the way people talk when they think the walls have ears. I didn't catch words, just tone. And tone, in my experience, tells you more than words ever could. I didn't confront her. That's the thing people don't understand about someone with my background. You don't show your hand early. You watch. You listen. You build a picture slowly, one piece at a time, until you have something you can actually use. By March, I had enough to call in favor. His name was Dennis Carver, 50 years old, built like a former linebacker, and the best skip tracer I'd ever worked with during my bureau days. He owed me one that went back 10 years in 3 states. I didn't ask him to do anything illegal. I just asked him to do what he always did. Find out what was true. You sure you want to know? Dennis asked over the phone, his voice carrying that flat, careful tone I recognized from 100 case briefings. I've been sure since February. I told him. He called me back in 2 weeks. What he found wasn't what I expected. It was worse. The man Margot had been seeing wasn't some guy from her social circle. It was Conrad Cunningham, 42, a city council member from Knoxville who'd spent the last 14 months running a campaign built entirely on the phrase family first. His face was on billboards. His wife and 3 kids smiled next to him in campaign mailers. He coached Little League on Saturdays. The whole performance. Dennis sent me a folder. 12 pages. Dates, locations, a paper trail of small hotel charges spread across 4 months. 2 of the meetings happened on nights Margot told me she was working late at the gala venue. I sat with the folder for a long time that evening after Paige went to bed. I didn't throw anything. I didn't pace. I just sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light and read it twice, the way I used to read case files, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that might change the interpretation. There were none. What I felt wasn't rage exactly. It was something colder. The sensation of understanding something completely for the first time after a long period of deliberate confusion, like fog lifting off a crime scene. I closed the folder. I poured a glass of water. I sat there until the clock above the stove read 11:43. Then I opened my laptop and started making my own notes. Because if Margot thought she was dealing with a man who would fall apart, cry, beg, or explode, she had spent 19 years not paying attention. I wasn't that man. I'd spent 16 years finding people who thought they'd cover their tracks. Now it was personal. The thing about financial fraud is that it always leaves footprints. People think they're being clever, routing money through vague descriptions, spreading transfers over months, using language that sounds legitimate on the surface. But numbers are honest. Numbers don't have the emotional intelligence to cover for you. I spent 15 years in the Bureau working financial crimes before I moved into counterintelligence. I knew exactly what I was looking at when I finally pulled our joint account records going back 18 months. It took me one evening and a yellow legal pad. The transfers started small, $600 to something listed as Meridian Event Consulting, $850 to CRC Creative Services, $1,100 to a vendor called Pinnacle Strategy Group. None of those companies appeared anywhere in Margot's official gala documentation. I cross-referenced every entry against her event budgets, which she kept in a shared household folder on her home network. No matches. Every one of those payments was a ghost. By the time I reached the bottom of the spreadsheet I'd built, the total came to $194,000. 14 months. 43 separate transactions. Each one small enough to avoid triggering an automatic bank alert, spread wide enough to look like ordinary business expenses if you weren't paying close attention. I was paying very close attention. I called Dennis the next morning from my car in the parking garage at work, engine off, door closed. The money trail leads to Cunningham, I told him, keeping my voice flat. Indirectly, but it's there. She's been feeding him. Dennis was quiet for a moment. How much? North of 190. He exhaled slowly, not surprised, just calculating. You want me to dig into his financials? I wanted to find out if he's as clean as his campaign posters. I replied. Because men who need that much money from someone else's wife usually aren't. It took Dennis 8 days. What he found unraveled Conrad Cunningham's entire public image in 3 pages. 2 failed commercial real estate ventures before he entered politics. A civil judgment from a former business partner for $67,000. Quietly settled, never publicized. And a current debt profile that Dennis estimated at close to $310,000. Spread across personal loans, and a second mortgage on a property not listed under his primary residence address. The man whose face smiled from campaign billboards with a tagline, "A leader you can trust," owed more than most people made in a decade. I sat with that for a night. Then I moved to the next problem. 2 weeks earlier, while reviewing something unrelated on our home server, I'd found a forwarded email thread that Margot had accidentally saved to the shared drive instead of her personal folder. It was brief, but it was enough. It referenced a complaint filed with my firm's HR department 10 months ago, anonymous, alleging pattern of unprofessional conduct and ethical boundary violations by a senior consultant on the Hartwell account. That was my account. My name wasn't in the email, but the project name was specific enough. I pulled the HR record through a contact I still had at the firm's legal department, someone who owed me a quiet professional courtesy. The complaint had been reviewed and dismissed within 3 weeks. No action taken. I hadn't even known it existed. But Margot had filed it. The timing aligned perfectly with when she would have been planning her exit. She tried to get me fired first, to weaken my financial position before the divorce papers arrived. When that failed, she'd shifted to the money transfers. I sat in my home office that night long after Paige had gone to sleep, the house quiet around me, the file open on my desk. The lamp threw a yellow circle on the papers, and everything outside it was dark. I thought about Paige. 13 years old, smart as a whip, still convinced her parents' marriage was solid. She'd come home from school that afternoon and show me a history project she'd been working on, something about post-war American families and how they rebuilt. She'd gotten an A- and was annoyed about the minus. I'd made her hot chocolate and told her the minus didn't matter and watched her argue with me cheerfully for 20 minutes about academic standards. She had no idea what was happening under the same roof. I picked up my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a family law attorney named Patricia Holt, whom a trusted colleague had recommended 6 months ago for reasons I hadn't understood at the time. I left a message requesting an urgent consultation. The second call was to my personal accountant. I told him I needed to move certain assets into a protected structure, legal, clean, properly documented, and that I needed it done before the end of the month. He asked if everything was all right. Everything's fine, I told him. I'm just planning ahead. That was true, in its way. I wasn't acting from anger. Anger is loud and imprecise, and it gives the other side information. What I felt was something quieter and more durable, the settled certainty of a man who has finished gathering evidence and is now deciding what to do with it. Conrad Cunningham had 3 weeks until his primary vote. I had a folder that would end his career in an afternoon. And Margot had no idea that the man she'd spent 14 months trying to quietly dismantle had spent the last 2 months building a case that would outlast anything she could throw at him. She thought she knew who I was. She was about to find out she'd never looked closely enough. There's a particular kind of cold that sets in when you realize someone tried to burn your life down quietly from the inside and nearly got away with it. I'm not a man who rattles easily. 16 years in federal investigations will do that. You learn to compartmentalize, to keep your face neutral while your mind runs hard in the background. But the morning I confirmed what Margot had done to my career, I sat in my car for 11 minutes in the parking garage before I trusted myself to walk into the office. She had filed a complaint in April of the previous year. I verified it through Linda Marsh, an HR administrator I'd known for 6 years. Not a friend exactly, but someone who understood professional discretion. She pulled the record on a quiet Tuesday and told me it had been reviewed and dismissed. Anonymous filing. Allegations of conduct inconsistent with firm standards on the Hartwell account. Vague enough to be nearly impossible to disprove, specific enough to make someone look twice. It hadn't gone anywhere. But that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was that my wife had tried to have me fired, systematically, anonymously, without leaving fingerprints, 11 months before she thought I knew anything. She was preparing the battlefield long before the first shot. I added it to my folder. Dennis had come through with something else that week. Cunningham's primary was 19 days out, and the man was running hard. New billboards had gone up on Route 40. A local news segment had aired the previous Sunday, featuring Conrad at a church barbecue, his arm around his wife, his kids chasing a dog across a lawn. The whole picture-perfect production. Dennis had found the name of the journalist who'd been quietly building a story on Cunningham's financial irregularities for the past 3 months. A woman named Karen Holt at the Knoxville Examiner. She hadn't published yet because she was still short of documentation. I wasn't short of documentation. I called Patricia Holt, my attorney, no relation to the journalist, that Wednesday. She reviewed everything I'd compiled and told me plainly. The financial transfers were recoverable in divorce proceedings. The anonymous HR complaint was admissible as evidence of premeditation, and my asset restructuring was already legally clean. You've done this before, she observed, not as a compliment exactly, more as a statement of fact. Different context, I replied. Same principles. That evening I came home to find Paige at the kitchen table, working through a geometry problem and frowning at her notebook like it had personally offended her. Margot was upstairs. I could hear her moving around, the soft click of closet doors, the particular rhythm of someone who thinks they're alone. I helped Paige with the geometry. We worked through 3 problems together, and she got all of them right on her own once I talked her through the first step. She was sharp like that. Needed someone to unlock the door, then she ran through it herself. Dad, she said at one point, not looking up from her notebook, is everything okay? Between you and Mom. I kept my expression steady. Why do you ask? She shrugged, pencil still moving. She's been weird. Quiet weird, not mad weird. Like she's waiting for something. I looked at my daughter for a moment. 13 years old, and she'd already learned to read the temperature of a room. Everything's fine, I told her quietly. I'm handling it. She looked up then, met my eyes, and gave me a small nod, the kind that said she didn't entirely believe me but trusted me enough to let it go. That was enough to carry. After she went to bed, I sat at my desk and made one final move for the night. I put together a sealed package, copies of the financial transfers, Cunningham's debt records, and Dennis's documentation of the hotel meetings, and I addressed it to Karen Holt at the Knoxville Examiner. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. The document spoke clearly enough. I didn't mail it yet. I held it in my hand for a moment. This small, ordinary-looking envelope that contained the end of a political career and the unraveling of a very carefully maintained lie. Then I sat on the corner of my desk. 19 days until the primary. I could wait 19 days. The confrontation I'd been building toward arrived on a Wednesday evening in a way I hadn't entirely planned, which told me Margot was more rattled than she was letting on. I came home at 7 to find her standing in the kitchen with her second phone face down on the counter and a glass of wine she hadn't touched. She'd clearly been waiting. The formal posture, the deliberate stillness. She was staging herself, the way she did before every gala speech. We should talk, she announced. I set my keys on the hook by the door and walked to the refrigerator for a bottle of water. I took my time. All right. She waited until I turned around, then said it like she was testing the weight of a weapon. I had dinner with someone last night. Someone I've been seeing. She watched my face for the reaction she expected. The wound. The collapse. The moment a lesser man hands over all his leverage in one unguarded second. I looked at her. Then I took a slow drink of water and set the bottle on the counter. I know, I said. I know about Conrad. I know about the transfers. I know about the HR complaint you filed in April. I kept my voice even, almost gentle. And so does my attorney. The color left her face so completely it was almost clinical. She tried to recover. Her mouth opened, closed. You don't understand what. You spent 14 months trying to take apart everything I built. I cut in, still quiet, still steady. While I was coaching Paige's school projects, running this house, and trusting you completely. And the one line I want you to sit with tonight, the one I want you to really think about before you say another word, is this. I leaned forward slightly. I have everything. All of it. And you have 19 days before Conrad Cunningham's primary.
She spent 14 months carefully dismantling this man's life, and in 60 seconds he dismantled everything she thought she had. I'm sorry, but I have zero sympathy for her. Zero.
She stood very still. What does that mean? She asked, her voice dropping to almost nothing. It means, I replied, picking up my water bottle and walking toward the hallway, that the next move is yours. Choose carefully. I left her standing there in the kitchen with her untouched wine and the quiet understanding that the man she thought she'd been managing for 14 months had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. She didn't come upstairs for a long time. I could hear her pacing below, the soft back and forth of someone whose strategy had just collapsed under them. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to it. Not with satisfaction. Not exactly. More with the exhausted, hollow certainty of a man who had just confirmed the last thing he'd hoped wouldn't be true, and who knew now, without any remaining doubt, exactly what came next. I didn't plan for Paige to find out the way she did. If I'm being honest, I've been telling myself I had more time, that I could control the order in which things unraveled, keep my daughter insulated from the worst of it until the legal picture was clearer. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. Paige dismantled it on a Thursday afternoon with her mother's iPad. I was in my home office reviewing documents when she appeared in the doorway. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing I noticed. She was standing very still, the way she stood when she was working through a geometry problem, processing, not reacting. The iPad was in her hand, screen dark. Dad, she said, I need to show you something. I knew from her voice before she said another word. She'd been looking up a recipe, something for a school project on regional cooking, and had picked up Margot's iPad from the kitchen counter by mistake. They had identical cases. Margot's was logged into an account synced to her second phone, and a notification had come through while Paige was holding it. She glanced at the screen without meaning to. Then she'd read the thread that opened. She set the iPad on my desk face up without a word. The message thread was between Margot and Conrad. It went back for months. The content wasn't graphic, nothing that crossed in a territory Paige shouldn't have seen, but it was unmistakable. Affectionate in the particular way that people are affectionate when they believe no one is watching. Plans. References to evenings together. A running shorthand that comes from time spent in each other's company. I looked at my daughter. She was watching me with those steady, serious eyes she'd had since she was 4 years old. How long have you known? She asked quietly. A while, I admitted. Are you handling it? Yes. She nodded once, slowly. Then she sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair client sat in when I consulted for the firm, and said, Tell me what I need to know. Not everything, just what I need. 13 years old. I thought about that for a moment. Then I told her the truth in the plainest terms I could manage. That her mother had made choices that had broken our marriage, that I had been working quietly to protect our family's financial security, and that whatever happened between me and Margot would not change one single thing about what she meant to me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the window for a moment, then back at me. Is she going to lose everything? Paige asked. She's going to face real consequences. I replied carefully. But I'm not trying to destroy her. I'm trying to make sure the truth comes out, and that we're both protected. Paige absorbed that. Then she stood, picked up the iPad, and said, I'm going to go do homework. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she added, Dad, she doesn't deserve you. Then she walked down the hall, and I sat there in the quiet of my office and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. That night, after Paige was in bed, I went downstairs and found Margot in the living room. She looked up from her phone, the second one, I noticed, with the practiced ease she'd been maintaining for months. Paige found your iPad today, I said. The ease evaporated instantly. She saw the thread with Conrad. I continued. She came to me. She handled it better than most adults would. Margot stood up. Trevor, I can explain. There's nothing to explain, I replied evenly. She knows. I know. My attorney knows. The only person still operating under any kind of illusion here is you. I crossed my arms. You're going to sit down with Paige this weekend, and you're going to tell her the truth, not a version of it, not a managed narrative. The truth. She's earned that. Margot's voice shook slightly when she answered. And if I don't? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I'll tell her myself. And she'll know you chose your comfort over her trust. Margot sat back down. Her hand pressed flat against her knee. She stared at the floor with the expression of someone finally beginning to understand the full weight of what they'd set in motion. I left her there and went upstairs. The house was quiet. I checked on Paige. Her light was off, her breathing slow, and even under the covers. I stood in her doorway for a moment, the way I had when she was small, just to confirm she was all right. She was. She always was. She was the toughest person in the building. I had known Dennis Carver for 23 years. We'd worked 3 federal investigations together before he went private. I'd been best man at his wedding, godfather to his oldest kid, the person he called at 2 in the morning when his father had a stroke and he needed someone to drive 4 hours without asking questions. I thought I knew everything about the man. I was wrong about that too. It came out sideways, the way these things usually do. I was having lunch with a mutual colleague, a retired agent named Phil Garrett, when Phil mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd run into Dennis a while back at a restaurant in Nashville. He was with Margot. Phil said, the way you say something you assume the other person already knows. The 4 of you finally getting back to normal after whatever that thing was last year. I kept my face neutral. Something like that. Phil moved on to other topics. I ate my lunch and said the right things and drove back to my office and sat very still for about 10 minutes. Dennis had been with Margot in Nashville at a restaurant Phil described as the kind of place you went for a long dinner, not a quick coincidence. I checked my records. That date was 14 months ago, the same window when the first transfer started appearing in our joint account. I called Dennis that evening from the driveway, engine running. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Trev. What's up? How long did you know? I asked. Silence. 3 full seconds of it. That was enough. Trevor. Don't, I cut in. I don't want a prepared answer. I want the truth. How long did you know about Margot and Cunningham? Another pause. Then, quietly, about a year. The number landed like a stone dropping into still water. 1 year. 12 months of case briefings, lunches, phone calls. 12 months of looking me in the eye. I didn't know how to tell you, Dennis continued, his voice carrying that particular strain of a man who has rehearsed an excuse so many times he no longer believes it himself. You were in a good place professionally. Paige was doing well. I thought maybe it would. Stop, I said. He stopped. You let me hire you to investigate my own wife, I said, knowing what you already knew. You took my money. You gave me information you've been sitting on for a year, as if you were discovering it fresh. I kept my voice level, not because I wasn't furious, but because fury without precision is just noise. That's not a friend who didn't know how to tell me. That a man who made a choice. Trevor, I swear I never thought. We're done, Dennis, I said. Whatever we were, it's finished. I ended the call and sat in the driveway for a long time. The engine idled. The neighborhood was quiet around me. A kid down the street was riding a bicycle in slow circles under a streetlight. I had come into this process believing my only enemies were Margot and Cunningham. I hadn't counted on discovering a second betrayal inside the first. I went inside, made coffee, and sat at my desk. I opened the envelope I'd been holding, the one addressed to Karen Holt of the Knoxville Examiner. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up a pen and added one additional document to the package, a brief, factual account of Dennis Carver's prior knowledge and his undisclosed conflict of interest during the investigation I'd hired him to conduct. I wasn't vindictive about it. It wasn't revenge. It was just the rest of the truth. I sealed the envelope, wrote the address cleanly across the front, and set it by the door. 11 days until the primary. Patricia Holt had warned me that divorce hearings rarely go cleanly. Too many emotions, too many attorneys performing for their clients, Too much history compressed into a procedural framework that wasn't built to hold it. She told me to stay quiet, stay composed, and let her do the talking unless directly addressed. I stayed quiet. I stayed composed. And when the moment came, I did exactly what needed to be done. The hearing was a preliminary asset division proceeding, not the final settlement, but the stage where each side establishes the financial picture they intend to argue from. Margot's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Clifford Vance, had clearly been briefed to come in aggressive. He opened by establishing me as emotionally withholding, a husband who prioritized his consulting career over his family, who was physically present but relationally absent, who had left Margot to carry the emotional weight of their household for the better part of a decade. He was skilled. I watched the two attorneys from the mediating panel shift slightly in their chairs as he built the image. Nothing he said was technically false. He'd just arranged selective truths into a portrait that bore no resemblance to the full picture. Patricia let him finish. Then she stood and asked the panel's permission to present a recorded exhibit. Vance objected on relevance grounds. The panel overruled him. Patricia pressed play on a tablet connected to the room speaker system. What came out of those speakers was Margot's voice, recorded 8 months ago on a call she'd made from our kitchen while I was traveling. Captured by the home security system, she'd forgotten I'd updated the previous spring. She was talking to someone I didn't recognize, a friend, a colleague, I wasn't certain. But the content was clear. She was describing me to this person in the particular dismissive shorthand of someone who has already mentally left a marriage. She called me predictable. She said I wouldn't notice anything because I never looked up from my work long enough to see what was right in front of me. She laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, and said, "He folds laundry and keeps schedules. He's dependable." Dependable isn't interesting. The room was very quiet when it ended. Margot sat to my left. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Vance tried to recover, arguing that the recording demonstrated nothing beyond marital dissatisfaction and had no bearing on asset division. Patricia responded by introducing the financial transfer records, all 43 transactions, the shell vendor names, the total of $194,000, and the documentation linking those transfers to Conrad Cunningham's personal accounts. One of the panel members leaned forward and asked Vance directly whether his client disputed the transfer records. Vance requested a brief recess. We took a 15-minute break. I stood by the window in the hallway and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and watched the parking lot below. Patricia came to stand beside me after a few minutes. "He's going to recommend she settle," she said quietly. "The recording plus the transfers. He can't build a sympathetic portrait over that foundation." "Good," I replied. "The asset protection you did in March is holding clean," she added. "The structure is solid. Whatever she gets in settlement, it won't touch the protected accounts." I nodded. I wasn't thinking about the accounts, if I'm honest. I was thinking about Paige, who was at school right now, sitting through a history class, carrying the knowledge of what her family had become with the particular quiet dignity that had always made her seem older than her years. I was thinking about what kind of life I was going to build for the two of us on the other side of all this paperwork. When we went back in, Vance was noticeably deflated. The hearing proceeded with less theater. By the end of the session, the panel had a clear financial picture. Patricia had entered all relevant documentation into the formal record, and Margot had not said a single word in 2 hours that meaningfully changed anything. She looked at me once as we filed out of the room. Her expression was hard to read. Not quite regret, not quite anger. Something more like the look of someone standing at the edge of a decision they can no longer take back. I held the door for her attorney. Then I walked out into the afternoon and called Paige from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. "How'd it go?" she asked. "The way it needed to," I told her. A pause. Then, "Good. I made spaghetti. Come home." I got in my car and drove home to my daughter's spaghetti and didn't look back once. The Knoxville Examiner ran the story on a Thursday morning, 8 days before the primary. I was at my desk when Dennis texted, old habit, I supposed, before he remembered we were finished. Just a link and no message. I didn't respond. I clicked through and read the piece twice. Karen Holt had done her job thoroughly. The article ran 14 paragraphs and covered Conrad Cunningham's financial history with the careful precision of someone who had been sitting on solid documentation and knew exactly how to use it. 2 failed commercial ventures. the civil judgment, the current debt load, and the transfers, described as funds received from a source connected to his personal relationship with a private citizen, without naming Margot directly, but with enough specificity that anyone who knew the Knoxville social circuit would not have to guess long. The story also referenced, in its final 3 paragraphs, a prior undisclosed financial relationship that had influenced the sourcing of the initial investigation. A clear reference to Dennis's conflict of interest, which I had included in the documentation package. By noon, Cunningham had canceled 2 campaign appearances. By 3 o'clock, his campaign manager had issued a statement describing the reporting as politically motivated. By 6, 3 other media outlets had picked up the story. By the following Monday, Conrad Cunningham had withdrawn from the race. I watched it unfold from a careful distance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat in my home office on Monday evening and read the withdrawal statement, which was 2 paragraphs long and cited personal reasons, and I thought about the billboard still standing on Route 40 with his face and his family, and the words, "A leader you could trust." Margot called me that evening. I let go to voicemail. She left a message that was short and stripped of its usual composure. Her voice sounded like someone standing in a room after all the furniture has been moved out. She said she needed to talk. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said she hadn't understood what she was walking into with Conrad, that she believed his version of himself, that she'd made decisions she couldn't undo, and she knew that. She said she was sorry. I sat with the voicemail for a while. I played a second time. Then I set the phone down and thought about 19 years. About the early years when we were genuinely good together, when she was funny and warm and made every room feel like somewhere you'd want to stay. About the slow drift that I told myself was just the natural settling of a long marriage. About the April morning she'd filed an anonymous complaint designed to end my career without ever looking me in the eye. Sorry was a word. It had weight depending on what stood behind it.
She said sorry. After 14 months of lies, stolen money, and a career she tried to destroy, she said sorry. I feel for this man deeply because I know that word still hurt him, even after everything she did.
I called Patricia the next morning and told her Margot had reached out. "What do you want to do?" Patricia asked. "She can say what she needs to say through the settlement process." I replied, "Keep moving." Patricia kept moving. What came out over the next 2 weeks, as Margot's attorney began genuinely negotiating rather than performing, was the full financial picture, including details Margot had not volunteered advance, details that only emerged when the formal discovery process compelled them. The $194,000 in transfers. A second credit account in Margot's name alone that had been carrying a balance of $38,000 in charges spread across hotels and travel. And the HR complaint, logged formally now as evidence of premeditated financial maneuvering, which substantially weakened her position on any claim to equitable sympathy. She kept none of what she tried to protect. The settlement, when it came, was clean. The protected assets stayed protected. The family home went to me. Paige needed stability, and the documentation made that argument easy. Margot received a fair portion of the joint liquid assets, her own debts, and a clear accounting of what the $194,000 had cost her in the final division. She signed on a gray Tuesday morning. No drama, just signatures and the scratch of a pen on paper. I drove home, made coffee, and stood in the kitchen for a while. The house was quiet. Paige was at school. The dog was asleep under the table. The spaghetti pot from 2 weeks ago was still in the drying rack because I kept forgetting to put it away. I put away. Then I sat down at the table with my coffee and let the quiet settle around me like something I'd earned. Margot had spent 3 years building her reputation as the organizing force behind the Knoxville Heritage Foundation's annual fundraising gala. It was her signature project, the thing she pointed to when people asked what she did, the thing that generated the warm profiles in local lifestyle magazines and the board invitations and the particular social credibility she'd cultivated so carefully among the city's professional class. The gala was scheduled for the second Saturday in November, 6 weeks after the preliminary hearing, 3 weeks after the Examiner's story had run. I didn't plan what happened next. I want to be clear about that. I didn't engineer it, didn't tip anyone off, didn't make a single call in that direction. But when you've spent 14 months operating in the shadows and the light finally comes on, it tends to illuminate more than just the immediate mess. One of the foundation's board members, a woman named Carol Delaney, who'd known Margot since their children were in preschool together, had read the examiner's story carefully. She was not naive about what the references to a private citizen meant. She had also, as it turned out, been quietly troubled for some months by certain discrepancies in the gala's vendor payments. Discrepancies that now, in light of what was publicly known, looked considerably less like administrative errors and considerably more like a pattern. Carol brought her concerns to the full board. The board requested an independent financial review of the last 2 gala cycles. That review, completed in 12 days, found $31,000 in vendor payments that could not be reconciled against services actually rendered. The shell vendor names overlapped with 2 of the names I'd already identified in our joint account records. Margot had been running the same playbook in both directions. She resigned from the foundation 3 days before the review's findings were formally presented. No statement, no press release, just a brief letter delivered to Carol Delaney's office on a Tuesday morning, citing personal reasons and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to serve. I heard about it through Patricia, who heard about it through the general professional network that connects family law in a mid-sized city in ways that are efficient, if not always comfortable. She's gone quiet, Patricia told me. Her attorney is moving towards settlement. The foundation situation has cost her the last argument she had left, which was that she was the one with community standing. Patricia paused. That argument is gone now. The settlement finalized on a Friday in late November. I sat across the table from Margot for the last time in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and I watched her sign her name 4 times on documents that ended 19 years of marriage in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. She looked tired, not broken. Margot was not the kind of woman who broke, but genuinely tired, the way people look when they've been carrying a performance for too long and finally set it down. When it was done, the attorney stepped out to process the paperwork. We were alone in the room for about 90 seconds. Neither of us spoke for most of it. Then Margot said, without looking at me, "I really did love you. At the beginning, I thought about that for a moment." "I know," I said. "I loved you too. I just stopped." She paused. "I stopped thinking about what I was throwing away." I nodded once. I didn't offer forgiveness, and I didn't offer contempt. Those were both performances, and we'd had enough of those. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and picked up my briefcase. "Take care of yourself, Margot," I said. And I meant it in the plain and limited way you mean something like that. Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. I walked out of the room and down the hall and through the glass doors into a November afternoon that was cold and clear and smelled like fallen leaves and would smoke from somewhere down the block. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. No phone calls, no next steps, no documentation to review. Just air. I called Paige from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring. "It's done," I told her. A pause. Then, "Come get me. I want to drive somewhere and get terrible fast food and not talk about any of it for 2 hours." I laughed. An actual, real laugh. The first one in a long time that came from somewhere unguarded at S. "Give me 20 minutes, I said. 8 months is a long time when you're rebuilding from the ground up, and not nearly long enough when you're still finding evidence of what you lost in unexpected places. A shared calendar notification that never got deleted, a Christmas ornament with both names on it, a note in Margot's handwriting tucked in a kitchen drawer about a dinner reservation from 2 years ago that never happened. You deal with each one and keep moving. Paige was the constant. She had settled into our new configuration, just the 2 of us in the house, Margot in an apartment across town, with the practical resilience she'd always had. She went to school, kept her grades, argued with me about reasonable things, and occasionally looked at me across the dinner table with an expression that was half her mother's precision and half something that was entirely her own. She'd started a journal. She didn't show it to me, and I didn't ask to see it. Some things a person works through privately, and the best you can do is make sure the house around them is steady. My consulting work had picked up in the spring. 3 new corporate security contracts, one of which was the most complex engagement I'd handled since leaving the bureau. It kept me sharp. It gave the days structure and the satisfaction of work that actually meant something. In April, Paige had a school history presentation, a research project on investigative journalism in America. She chose Karen Holt's Examiner piece on Conrad Cunningham as one of her primary sources. She didn't tell me until after she'd received her grade, a solid A, with a teacher's note that said her analysis of how documentation shapes public accountability was unusually mature for her grade level. She showed me the graded paper at dinner and said nothing, just slid it across the table and watched me read it. I looked up at her. Good research, I said. She smiled, quick, satisfied, entirely page. I learned from someone. Cunningham had not returned to public life. His wife had filed for divorce 4 months after the Examiner story ran. He was reportedly working in private commercial real estate, a quieter life, appropriately sized to what he'd actually earned. The billboards came down. The campaign mailers went into recycling bins. Knoxville moved on. Dennis Carver had reached out twice, once by text, once by voicemail. I hadn't responded. Some bridges, once you've examined what they were actually built on, aren't worth the materials to repair. In May, I was at a school fundraiser, the spring auction, the kind of event I'd always attended alone while Margot worked the rooms separately, when I found myself standing next to a woman named Claire Whitaker. She was a pediatric occupational therapist, there because her nephew was in Paige's grade. She had an easy, unhurried way of talking that reminded me, oddly, of the way good investigators ask questions, genuinely curious, not performing interest. We talked for 45 minutes without either of us noticing the time passing. I didn't ask for her number. Neither did she. But as the auction was wrapping up, she said, "There's a pretty decent farmer's market on Saturday mornings over on Market Square. In case you ever find yourself with nothing better to do." I told her I'd heard the coffee stand there was worth the trip. She smiled and said, "It is." I didn't go that Saturday, but the one after I did. And she was there, looking at heirloom tomatoes with the same focused attention she probably brought to everything. And when she saw me, she just said, "Coffee stands to the left," and kept moving, and I followed. And it was easy in the way that things are easy when you're not trying to make them into something they aren't yet. Nothing was decided. Nothing was rushed. It was just two people on a Saturday morning with decent coffee and no particular agenda, which was exactly what it needed to be. I told Paige about it that evening. Matter-of-factly, no preamble. She looked at me over her soup, considered for a moment, and said, "What's she like?" "Straightforward," I replied. "Honest. Interested in things." Paige nodded slowly, the way she did when she was reserving judgment, but leaning toward approval. "Okay," she said. "That's a reasonable start." I agreed with her. It was, I thought, exactly the right kind of start, measured, unhurried, built on what was actually there rather than what I wished were there. The way anything worth keeping ought to begin. The house was ours. The life was ours. And whatever came next would be built properly, from the foundation up, with no hollow spaces underneath. That was something I could work with.
Trevor didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't lose himself. He did something harder. He stayed composed, stayed focused, and made sure the truth landed exactly where it needed to. That's not weakness. That's what real strength actually looks like. If this story hit close to home, or if you know someone who needed to hear it, share it. And thank you for being here with me today. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.